hush fell over the packed courtroom in downtown Cleveland, Ohio, when the heavy oak doors swung open with a long, resonant creak. The defendant, Henry Morales, sat rigid in his chair, his eyes filled with resignation, as the prosecutor finished laying out a damning array of evidence. Judge Harriet Whitmore, known throughout the state for her uncompromising demeanor, was about to deliver a crucial ruling when a small voice sliced through the tension like a lightning bolt. "Stop!" The word reverberated, impossible to ignore. Heads whipped around and gasps rattled through the audience. Standing near the aisle, dwarfed by the adults around him, was a boy no older than 10. Nobody knew how he'd slipped past the bailiff or why he was standing there, trembling yet resolute, as if preparing to confront the entire world. Judge Whitmore, her stern features framed by square-rimmed glasses and a tidy bun of gray-streaked hair, lifted her gaze from the bench. "Bailiff," she commanded, voice echoing against the polished courtroom walls. "Escort that child out. Now." Her usual control slipped just a fraction, revealing the shock lurking beneath. The bailiff moved, but the boy's voice rose again, fueled by what could only be described as desperate certainty. "Please," he shouted, small fists bunched at his sides, "I know something important. You can't send him to prison because he didn't do it." The silence that descended was one of disbelief, like the sharp inhale before a collective cry. Henry Morales, the defendant, blinked as if seeing a ghost. The prosecutor's jaw hung slightly ajar. Even the audience looked as though they were witnessing something that leapt from the pages of a sensational novel. For an instant, it seemed time had frozen. Then Judge Whitmore slammed her gavel with a resounding crack. "Order!" she demanded, her voice authoritative enough to command a battlefield. But her expression wavered, curiosity and a flash of concern colliding. "Bailiff, bring that boy forward. I want to know exactly what's going on." In the hush, the boy's sneakers squeaked against the floor as he walked timidly toward the bench. He looked up at the judge with wide brown eyes that glistened, fear and determination intertwined. A hush of whispers rippled around the courtroom, as though everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. "Son," Judge Whitmore said, softer this time, "what is your name, and what do you claim to know about this case?" The child swallowed hard. "My name's Toby Archer," he began, voice quivering only slightly. His shoes were scuffed, his jeans a size too short. "I'm sorry I interrupted your court, Your Honor, but I can't let an innocent man go to prison. Henry Morales is not guilty. I saw who really did it, or at least I saw a clue. I think I know who's behind everything." In that instant, you could have heard a pin drop. Then commotion flared up like wildfire. The prosecutor began to object. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for cameras, tongues wagging with the promise of a blockbuster story. Henry Morales' defense attorney, a wiry, middle-aged man named Weston Pierce, went pale. Meanwhile, Toby's words hung in the stillness like an ominous chord. Judge Whitmore raised her gavel again. Another sharp crack. "Order! Everyone, sit down. We will recess to my chambers. Bailiff, escort Mr. Morales, Mr. Pierce, the prosecutor, and young Mr. Archer. No cameras, no further witnesses until I say so." And just like that, the entire trial took an unexpected turn. Lawyers gathered their papers in haste, spectators buzzed with curiosity, and Toby Archer clutched the edges of his hoodie as the bailiff guided him away. In that moment, the boy was thinking of only one thing, the memory of a quiet afternoon that had shattered his own small world and threatened to destroy an innocent man's life forever. They called it the Lakeview murder case, a sensational story that had gripped the city for weeks. The victim, a local teacher named Fiona Hayes, had been found strangled in a derelict neighborhood near Lake Erie's industrial docks. Suspicion had quickly fallen on Henry Morales, a friend of Fiona's who was rumored to have had arguments with her shortly before her death. The evidence against him was mostly circumstantial, no direct witnesses, but enough to paint a grim picture. The city's tabloids feasted on the story. Teacher's best friend turns killer, and dark secrets emerge in brutal murder. Everyone in Cleveland had an opinion, convinced Henry must have snapped. It was an open and shut case, or so the prosecution claimed, until Toby Archer risked everything to shout the truth. The reason Toby was in that courthouse started weeks ago on one ordinary Friday after school. He had been riding his old BMX bike through Roosevelt Park, an oasis of green in an otherwise bustling section of the city. A row of towering oak trees lined the central pond, their leaves a canopy rustling with springtime breezes. Toby, who had grown up playing here, knew every trail and hidden nook. That afternoon, while practicing a new bike trick, Toby heard a voice echo from the trail near the pond. It was a woman's cry, sharp, distressed, followed by angry shouting. Curiosity flickered, and he pedaled closer, weaving through the trees, trying to stay out of sight. Then he spotted them. A man in a black jacket, standing rigidly, face twisted in anger. Opposite him was a woman Toby didn't recognize, her features partially hidden by the shadows of tall branches. Their argument reverberated in the tranquil air, an intrusion of chaos in an otherwise peaceful setting. "You have to end it," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I warned you. This can't go on. We promised we wouldn't." The man's response was muffled, a snarl of words Toby couldn't catch. Then, in a flash, the man seized the woman's wrist, jerking her closer. Toby gripped his handlebars so tight his knuckles whitened. He wanted to do something, anything, but fear pinned him in place. In one violent motion, the man shoved the woman up against a tree, his gaze darting left and right as if checking for witnesses. Toby's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't have a cell phone yet. Mom had said he wasn't old enough. He stared wide-eyed as the man hissed something in the woman's ear. She managed to push him away, but he grabbed her again. Then, from behind Toby, a sudden rustling of bushes. Another person appeared, running toward the commotion. Toby jerked back, pressing himself flat behind the trunk of a massive oak. He couldn't see the newcomer's face clearly, only that it was a tall figure wearing a dark hoodie. The newcomer shouted, "Stop! Are you out of your mind?" Toby dared not move. The tension crackled. The original man took a step back, muttered something, and then the woman bolted. The second figure sprinted after her. Moments later, the entire group vanished deeper into the park, leaving Toby alone with a sinking feeling that he just witnessed something terribly wrong. For a week, Toby tried to push the memory aside. He had tests to study for, a baseball tryout that weekend, typical problems for a boy his age. But the scene replayed in his mind every night. He'd see the fear in the woman's eyes, the anger in that man's face. Toby mentioned it once to his best friend Kevin, but they both shrugged, uncertain how to respond. Toby couldn't just forget it. Then, the local news ran a story about Fiona Hayes' murder. A photograph flashed on the screen, Fiona smiling in front of a blackboard. Toby's stomach twisted. She wasn't the woman he'd seen in the park, or at least he didn't think so. But as the anchor discussed the timeline, Toby recalled that the park was just 2 miles away from the industrial docks. The time frame matched. Fiona had died the same evening Toby saw the argument. That twinge of dread returned. Something wasn't right. He recognized Henry Morales' face from the broadcast. He taught at the same community center Toby's mom used to volunteer at. Henry was being questioned by police. They said he had argued with Fiona earlier that week. Toby remembered the enraged voice he'd heard in the park, but was it Henry's? He wasn't sure. Henry's face always seemed gentle on TV interviews. Toby felt stuck, uncertain. He also recalled glimpsing a second figure, that sudden newcomer in a hoodie. The news, however, made no mention of anyone else. A restlessness sparked in Toby, like an alarm that wouldn't stop ringing. In times like these, Toby's mother, Leslie Archer, a single parent who worked 2 jobs, usually told him, "If something feels wrong, speak up, even if your voice shakes." Toby cherished that advice, though he never guessed he'd put it to use in such a dramatic fashion. Meanwhile, time ticked forward. Police insisted Henry was their main suspect. The evidence, though all circumstantial, seemed to align. Opportunity, argument, no solid alibi. Fiona's family was distraught. The city demanded justice. Toby felt like he was watching an unstoppable train hurtling toward a broken bridge. He tried once to call the police tip line, but lost his nerve halfway. He told himself, "You're just a kid. You probably saw something else entirely." Days passed. The guilt gnawed at him like termites in old wood. Then, on the day of Henry Morales' trial, Toby's mother had jury duty at the same courthouse. Toby was off school for a teacher's in-service day and had to accompany her downtown. She told him to stay in the waiting area with a bag of snacks and a puzzle book. Toby swore he would. Yet the pull of that unresolved memory, the knowledge that an innocent person might be on trial, spurred him to do the unthinkable. He sneaked away from the waiting area, found the floor of Henry's trial, and slipped inside the packed courtroom just as the prosecutor was finishing a closing statement. The tension was like an electric charge in the air. Toby's heart hammered, sweat dotting his forehead. He stood at the back, overwhelmed by the solemnity of the proceedings. Then the judge began to speak, and Toby heard the finality in her tone. She was preparing to deliver instructions that could seal Henry Morales' fate. That's when Toby's trembling voice cut in, loud enough to echo, "Stop!" And now here he was in the judge's chambers. Judge Harriet Whitmore glowered across her desk. The oak panels on the walls carried the weight of centuries of justice. Toby fidgeted, aware that half a dozen grown-ups stared at him like he was either a hero or a nuisance. Henry Morales sat to the side, guarded by an officer, looking frail, a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. The prosecutor, a man in a crisp suit and a tight frown, tapped his pen irritably. Weston Pierce, Henry's defense attorney, tried to appear composed, but Toby sensed the lawyer's silent hope that something, anything, might crack the case wide open. "Toby Archer," Judge Whitmore repeated, her voice calmer than in the courtroom. "You say you have information that proves Mr. Morales is innocent. This is a serious claim. I need you to tell me everything you know, from the very beginning." Toby inhaled, eyes downcast, his small hands twisting in his lap. This was it. He had to speak. "I was in Roosevelt Park," he began, voice barely above a whisper. "A few weeks ago, around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I heard an argument. I saw a man in a black jacket and a woman. He grabbed her, shouted something, then someone else ran up. A tall person in a hoodie. I heard them yelling. The first man, looked like he was furious. I couldn't see faces too well, but I know it wasn't Mr. Morales. The voice was different." The prosecutor scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, this is speculative at best. The child might be mixing up times or people. A lot of folks walk through Roosevelt Park. This line of testimony—" "Quiet," Judge Whitmore said softly, a glint in her eyes. "Let the boy finish." Toby wet his lips. "When I saw the news about Miss Hayes, I was sure it had to be connected. The timing matches. The place is near where her body was found. Everyone's saying Mr. Morales argued with her that night. But I saw 2 different people. A woman who wasn't Fiona Hayes, and a man who definitely wasn't Henry Morales. He was bigger, stronger, maybe." Henry glanced up, hope flickering on his face. His lawyer leaned in, riveted. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" asked Weston Pierce. Toby stared at the floor. "I was scared. I'm just a kid. I thought no one would believe me. But I saw something. And if this helps—" He trailed off. The tension felt thick enough to slice. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses, exhaled, and considered Toby carefully. "It's extremely unusual to consider brand new eyewitness testimony this late in a trial, especially from a minor," she said. "But ignoring possible evidence is not an option, particularly when a man's life is at stake. Mr. Pierce, do you wish to file a motion to reopen or present this new testimony?" Pierce was on his feet so quickly he nearly toppled his chair. "Absolutely, Your Honor." The prosecutor began to protest, but the judge halted him with a raised hand. "Mr. Randall, if you have objections, you may present them in formal response. For now, this hearing is recessed until 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll speak with Toby Archer privately, along with counsel. Henry Morales remains in custody. Are we clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor muttered, face taut. Toby felt a swirl of conflicting emotions: relief, fear, uncertainty. He'd stepped into an adult world of attorneys and legal codes, exposing himself in a way he'd never imagined. As Toby was led away, he caught Henry Morales' gaze. The man whispered, "Thank you," and Toby's heart lurched, realizing just how high the stakes were. Later that evening, Toby and his mother sat in their small apartment's living room. Leslie Archer was furious, though not at Toby in the way he'd expected. She'd learned about his courtroom interruption from a bailiff who recognized her in the hallway. Now, pacing across the worn carpet, she asked, "Toby, do you have any idea what danger you might be putting yourself in?" "I'm sorry," Toby murmured, "but I couldn't watch them convict Mr. Morales if he's innocent." Leslie's anger softened, replaced by maternal worry. She knelt in front of Toby, hands on his shoulders. "I'm proud of you for wanting to do the right thing, but please, let the authorities handle it. Don't go investigating on your own." Toby managed a small nod, though something in his gut told him this was bigger than he'd expected. The next morning, Toby was summoned again to the courthouse for a private discussion with both attorneys. Weston Pierce wanted every detail Toby could recall, any distinct clothing, any words he overheard. Toby repeated what he remembered, but a wave of nerves made it feel jumbled. The prosecutor grilled him about times, angles of visibility, possible confusion. Judge Whitmore, presiding over this closed session, took notes methodically. Meanwhile, Henry Morales watched with quiet intensity, as though each of Toby's words might be a key to his cell door. Toby described the man's black jacket, the woman's voice, and the sudden arrival of the hooded figure. Yet his recollection was limited, and the grown-ups seemed frustrated they didn't have an unequivocal piece of evidence tying the real culprit to Fiona Hayes' murder. The hearing concluded with the judge ordering a brief delay in final arguments to allow the defense to investigate Toby's claims. As the lawyers filed out, Toby overheard the prosecutor telling someone that the kid is no more than a distraction, and it's probably a coincidence. Toby's stomach churned. What if the adults brushed him off? He couldn't let that happen. As Toby and his mother left the courthouse that day, a man in a leather jacket lurked at the base of the steps. He appeared to be fiddling with his phone, but as Toby passed by, he heard the man murmur in a low voice, "Stop talking, kid, or you'll regret it." Toby froze. Before he could fully react, the man merged into the throng of people and disappeared. Leslie sensed something amiss. "Honey, are you okay?" Toby's heart pounded. He forced a nod, not wanting to scare her, but that evening, the memory consumed him. That quiet threat was enough to confirm his worst fears. The murderer might still be out there, and Toby had just become a target. As Benjamin Franklin once said, Toby remembered his mother telling him in a different context, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." He clung to that idea like a lifeline. He refused to stand by, no matter the risk. The next day brought gray skies and drizzling rain. Toby tried to attend school, but his mind was miles away. During recess, he wandered the playground alone, wrestling with guilt and worry. He knew if he had truly seen something that could exonerate Henry Morales, then burying his head in the sand would only let the killer roam free. After school, Toby gathered his meager courage and pedaled his bicycle to Roosevelt Park once more, hoping to find any clue to confirm his memory. Drizzle soaked his hoodie, and the park was nearly deserted. He revisited the spot beneath the oak trees, the gravel path still scattered with last autumn's leaves. Frustration mounted. No sign of anything suspicious. Then a flash of color caught his eye near the base of a thick elm. He crouched down and found a small silver pendant, half buried in the dirt. It looked like a broken piece of jewelry, maybe from a bracelet or necklace. Toby's stomach flipped. Could this have belonged to the mysterious woman, or even to Fiona Hayes? He wiped off the mud, revealing faint initials. R.G. Toby had no idea who R.G. might be, but the detail felt significant. Heart-hammering, Toby tucked the pendant into his pocket. The longer he stayed, the more vulnerable he felt, as though eyes might be tracking him from the shadows of the trees. He swung his leg over his bike seat and sped home. That night, Toby used his mother's old laptop to search for anyone connected to Fiona Hayes or Henry Morales with those initials. He found references to Rachel Gleason, a colleague of Fiona's who'd vanished from the local scene weeks before the murder, but nothing definitive. Toby's search was cut short by a thunderous pounding on the front door. Leslie Archer, alarmed, went to answer. Toby lingered in the hallway. Through the crack in the door, he glimpsed a tall figure in a baseball cap. "You might want to tell that kid of yours," the stranger growled, "to keep out of business that isn't his. Innocent curiosity can be very dangerous." With that, the stranger turned and walked off into the stormy night. Toby's mother locked the door, her hand shaking. She demanded to know what Toby had done, who he might have angered. He told her everything: the trip to the park, the broken pendant, the suspicion that someone else was behind Fiona's murder. Leslie's face blanched with fear, but she held Toby's shoulders. "We're calling the police," she said firmly. "This has gone too far." Officer Mildred Saunders arrived late that night, an older woman with a calm, steady presence. She listened to Toby's story and examined the pendant. Though she didn't seem entirely convinced, she promised to file a report. Toby could see in her eyes that weary look grown-ups often give children, as though what they say might be partially imagined. But Toby refused to be dismissed. Early the following morning, Toby walked to the local precinct and asked for Officer Saunders. He repeated his insistence that if RG stood for Rachel Gleason, maybe Rachel witnessed something crucial about the murder. Officer Saunders, perhaps touched by Toby's earnestness, agreed to pass the info to the detective squad. Toby left feeling half hopeful. At least now, the evidence might be in the right hands. But as the day crawled on, Toby grew uneasy, convinced that the killer had eyes everywhere. That evening, Toby and his mother decided it would be best for him to stay with a family friend in the suburbs for a couple of nights, away from potential threats. But Toby was determined to attend Henry's hearing in the morning, as the judge had declared the trial would resume with Toby's testimony. That next morning arrived with an overcast sky, leaves swaying in an oddly chilly breeze for that time of year. Toby sat in the same courthouse corridor, knee bouncing uncontrollably. A man in a suit passed by, glancing at Toby as if to say, "Why is a child here, at the center of such a high-stakes murder trial?" Toby ignored the stares. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore convened the session. Weston Pierce approached the bench, requesting permission to present Toby's additional findings. The judge allowed Toby to step forward. The microphone towered over him, so the bailiff brought a stool. Toby produced the silver pendant. "I found this in Roosevelt Park," he told them, voice quavering. "The initials could be RG. I read that Fiona had a coworker named Rachel Gleason who vanished right before the murder. What if?" "Objection," the prosecutor cut in. "Speculative. No chain of custody, no direct link to the victim." Toby's cheeks reddened with frustration. "But it might matter," he insisted, blinking back tears. "Miss Hayes' murder might not be what you think." The prosecutor sighed, but Judge Whitmore gestured for silence. "We'll allow it for consideration, but the court requires more concrete proof. Mr. Pierce, see if any records connect Rachel Gleason to that jewelry. Otherwise, we can't rely on it in trial." She turned to Toby. "Thank you for your effort, young man, but for your own safety, let the attorneys handle further investigation." Toby felt the finality in her words. They wanted him to walk away, to trust the system. But a single spark flared inside him. The system was about to convict an innocent man if they couldn't piece this puzzle together in time. Toby slid off the stool, frustration coiling in his gut. Henry Morales looked at him with eyes that seemed to say, "Thank you for trying." The hearing moved on. Toby was ushered back into the gallery. The discussion turned toward the circumstantial evidence again, the prosecution unwavering in painting Henry as the killer. Toby's heart sank. As the day wore on, Toby stepped out into the courthouse hallway for a breather. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice hissed near his ear. "Poking around is going to get someone hurt." Toby spun, finding no one but a swirl of suits hurrying about. Anxiety surged. He rushed to find his mother, but she was in a different waiting area. Toby's pulse pounded, a sense of encroaching danger closing in. After court recessed, Toby reunited with Leslie, and they hurried to the station, hoping Officer Saunders had discovered something about Rachel Gleason. But at the precinct, Toby learned that Saunders was out in the field. Another officer took his statement, but there was no new information. Toby left, feeling helpless. The only path left, it seemed, was to investigate on his own. That evening, Toby rummaged through online forums and old news articles on the borrowed laptop of his mom's friend. He found a partial staff directory from Fiona Hayes' former workplace. Yes, Rachel Gleason had indeed worked there. She abruptly resigned a week before Fiona's death. Rumor had it she had evidence of something shady, but vanished after complaining of being threatened. Toby's mind reeled. Rachel could be the missing link. If Toby could find her, or evidence that she and Fiona stumbled upon some secret, maybe he could prove Henry's innocence. Toby jotted down every snippet of info he could find. An old address, a mention of a coffee shop she frequented. Then he paused, remembering how each step he took deeper into this mystery seemed to tighten the noose around him. That night, he barely slept. A noise in the alley behind the suburban house startled him awake multiple times. His mind conjured images of a shadowy figure lurking, but fear wouldn't silence the fire in his chest. He had to see this through. At dawn, Toby told Leslie he needed to speak to Weston Pierce. His mother, though hesitant, agreed to drive him to the lawyer's office downtown, provided he promised not to do anything crazy. Mr. Pierce's law firm was a cramped set of rooms in an aging high-rise. The waiting area was decorated with dusty law books and a lone potted plant. When Toby explained who he was, Pierce rushed out. His rumpled shirt and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a man fighting a losing battle. "Toby," he said, ushering the boy into his small office, "I appreciate your determination, but this is dangerous territory. Our investigators have limited time before final arguments. We're doing everything we can to follow up on your lead about Rachel, but I need more than speculation. We only have 2 days left." "I know," Toby said, swallowing the lump in his throat, "but I found her last known address. Maybe you can ask the police to check it out?" Pierce looked at the piece of paper Toby held out. He frowned. "Might be worth a try. I'll call the precinct. Meanwhile, Toby, let me handle this. For your own safety, don't chase leads alone." Toby forced a nod, but the seed of an idea had already taken root in his mind. If the police and Pierce's investigators were swamped, Toby could at least peek around Rachel's old address. Maybe there was some leftover clue, a piece of mail, anything that could confirm her link to Fiona. Toby convinced his mother to take him out for lunch near the old address. She was hesitant, but he played down the risks, saying he'd stay in public, not do anything dangerous. She finally relented, driving to a worn-out district with older brick buildings and narrow side streets. Toby hopped out in front of a closed antique shop a few blocks away. "I'll just look around the corner," Toby insisted. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Leslie bit her lip, but allowed it, though she hovered in her car, eyes never leaving the street. Toby trudged down the block to the address scribbled in his notebook. The building was a dilapidated townhouse, a "for rent" sign plastered crookedly on the door. Windows were boarded on the lower level. Toby circled around the back, heart thudding. "Just a quick look," he murmured. The yard was overgrown with weeds, trash and old boxes scattered near a rusted chain-link fence. Something about the place felt eerie, as though it held secrets beneath its chipped paint. Toby spotted a side door. He tugged the handle gently. Locked. He stepped back, scanning for cameras or signs of occupancy. None. A battered mailbox was attached to the back wall, uncollected flyers spilling out. Toby's pulse jumped when he noticed a name on one of the old envelopes, Rachel Gleason. This must be the right address. The envelope was half open, battered by weather. He reached in, carefully slid it out, and found a second letter behind it. The second letter bore no name, just an initial, R. Toby's heart hammered. Could Rachel have left in a hurry, leaving behind vital clues? He opened the envelope, expecting maybe a bill or junk mail. Inside was a slip of paper with scribbled writing. The words were smudged, but Toby read. Fiona discovered their arrangement. She wanted to expose them. I promised to help, but they're on to us. Meeting at Oakwood Docks. Must act fast. If I disappear, show this to the authorities. R. Toby's hands shook. This was it. Actual proof that Fiona had been onto something bigger, and Rachel was trying to help her reveal it. Toby stuffed the note into his pocket, his mind racing. Oakwood Docks was just a few miles from Roosevelt Park, near the industrial waterfront. Fiona's body had been found near the docks. This wasn't just a random argument or a personal dispute. It pointed to something orchestrated, an arrangement that Fiona had discovered. As Toby stepped away, a sudden crunch of gravel from the alley made his blood freeze. He ducked behind a stack of boxes, heart thumping. He peered around to see a looming figure in a dark hoodie stepping into the yard, scanning the ground. Toby's heart hammered so loud he thought it would give him away. The figure took another step, pausing near the mailbox. Toby backed away slowly, creeping along the fence. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, he dashed toward the street, bounding around the corner. Leslie spotted him, alarmed as he raced to the car. Without waiting for an explanation, she fired up the engine, and they sped off. Toby clutched the note in his pocket, panting. We have to give this to Mr. Pierce, Toby insisted, and the police. Leslie's hands trembled on the wheel. Fine, but Toby, dear God, no more running around on your own. That man, whoever he is, he's following us. Toby swallowed hard, recalling the threat outside the courthouse. He didn't argue. They went straight to Pierce's office. Toby presented the crumpled note. Pierce's eyes widened. Arrangement? Meeting at Oakwood Docks. Toby, this is huge. This could show motive outside of Henry's involvement. If Fiona was killed because she threatened to expose a bigger crime, maybe corruption or an illegal deal, this changes everything. Pierce grabbed his phone, calling his investigator and the police. Toby exhaled shakily, relief warring with fear. Now at least, there was a solid lead, but the look in Pierce's eyes told Toby the danger was still very real. "Whoever's behind this," Pierce muttered, "they won't stop until they silence every witness." That night, Toby and Leslie relocated to a safer location arranged by a friend of Pierce, an empty apartment in a complex with better security. Toby barely slept, nightmares full of shadowy figures and the memory of that woman's fearful cry in the park. Meanwhile, the police quietly reopened lines of inquiry about Rachel Gleason, searching for her or any record that might tie Fiona's murder to a broader conspiracy. The next morning, Henry Morales' trial resumed. With the newly discovered note, Pierce requested a stay of proceedings, citing potential exculpatory evidence. The prosecutor bristled, but the judge agreed to postpone final arguments by 48 hours. "We cannot, in good conscience, proceed if there's reason to believe the true killer remains at large," Judge Whitmore announced. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, a sense that the entire case had twisted into murkier waters. Toby, seated beside his mother in the back row, felt a flicker of hope. Henry Morales caught Toby's eye across the courtroom and managed a faint nod. Toby recognized it as gratitude and desperation. That afternoon, Toby and his mother accompanied Pierce to meet with Detective Farley, the officer now assigned to investigate the new lead. Farley was tall, with silver hair and a stare honed from decades of police work. He asked Toby detailed questions about the note, the address, the figure in the yard. Toby answered earnestly, sensing that for once a grown-up believed him without condescension. Farley tapped a pen on the desk, eyebrows furrowed. "This all suggests Miss Hayes and Miss Gleason were on the verge of revealing some wrongdoing that could implicate powerful individuals. If that's the case, we may be dealing with more than just a personal dispute." Toby's mother shuddered. "So it could be an organized crime connection?" "Possibly," Farley replied. "We'll check records of the Oakwood Docks. They've been rumored to be a hub for illegal shipments, but we've never had solid proof." Toby recalled the voices from the park, the aggression in the man's tone. They said something about "end it," "we promise," "this can't go on." It sounded bigger than a personal argument. Detective Farley nodded, scribbling notes. "Thank you, Toby. We'll see if that lines up with any known activity at the docks." Toby opened his mouth to ask a question, but a sudden ring from Farley's phone interrupted him. The detective answered, face darkening as he listened. Then he ended the call. "We may have found something," he said tersely. "A tip about a possible sighting of Rachel Gleason near an abandoned warehouse by the docks. I'll send a team." Toby's heart soared at the possibility that Rachel was still alive. She might confirm everything and free Henry Morales once and for all. Meanwhile, the clock ticked toward Henry's next court appearance. The tension was excruciating. Toby and Leslie waited in the station for news, hours dragging by. Finally, an officer approached Detective Farley, whispering in his ear. The older man's expression turned grim. "No sign of Miss Gleason," Farley said to Toby and Pierce. "But we did find a hidden storage room containing suspicious documents, ledgers, shipping logs. They reference payments to individuals with initials. We'll need to decode who's behind them." Toby's mind whirled. This was bigger than he'd imagined. A hidden storage room suggested a clandestine operation. If Fiona Hayes had stumbled onto that, no wonder she ended up dead. Toby thought of the battered letter, the mention of arrangement, and felt chills. That night, the sense of being watched crept up Toby's spine again. He peered out the window of the borrowed apartment. No suspicious figure, but the fear refused to leave him. After so many threats, he realized that once you shine a light on dark corners, the shadows fight back. He curled up under the blanket, remembering a quote his mother loved. "In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity," often attributed to Albert Einstein. Toby clung to that, hoping this near-impossible situation might lead to justice. The next morning, a significant breakthrough sent shockwaves through the case. Detective Farley discovered that the logs from the warehouse matched shipments tied to a local businessman, Charles Beckett. a powerful figure rumored to have connections in the city's political circles. The documents suggested Fiona Hayes had discovered Beckett's illegal trafficking of stolen electronics or possibly drugs. She confided in Rachel Gleason, who tried to help her expose it. Toby's memory of the park argument gained new clarity. The man in the black jacket might have been one of Beckett's enforcers, threatening the women to keep quiet. But how to prove it in court? And more importantly, how to connect Henry Morales to the conspiracy's crossfire? Toby felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. If Charles Beckett had men who would kill to protect his operation, Toby's life was definitely at risk. So was Henry Morales's. If the conspirators had pinned the murder on him, it would keep suspicion away from themselves. Time was running out. Early that afternoon, Toby was at the precinct again, reviewing the logs with Pierce and the detective, when a call came in from an unknown number on Toby's phone. Toby hesitated but answered quietly. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was raspy, trembling. "Is this the boy who's been asking about Fiona?" Toby's throat went dry. "Yes? Who are you?" "I'm Rachel Gleason," the woman whispered. Toby's eyes widened. He frantically waved at Pierce and Detective Farley, putting the call on speaker. "Rachel, where are you? People have been looking for you." "Listen carefully," she cut in, urgency throbbing in her voice. "I can't talk long. They're after me." But Henry Morales had nothing to do with this. Fiona found out Beckett's men were smuggling goods through Oakwood docks. Fiona thought they were exploiting students from her school for forced labor. Her words cut off in a gasp, as though startled by something. Then silence. Toby's heart pounded. "Rachel? Rachel?" No response. The call ended. Pierce traded a glance with Detective Farley. This was direct confirmation from the missing witness. Henry Morales had simply been the scapegoat. But was it enough? And was Rachel still alive? Time was of the essence. Toby realized that if the conspirators were tracking calls, Rachel was in immediate danger. Detective Farley moved quickly, trying to trace the call, but it bounced off multiple towers. Frustrated, he told Toby, "At least we have a statement. However short, it corroborates your lead." Toby felt a jolt of determination. They had to act. The only way to ensure Henry Morales wouldn't face a wrongful conviction was to bring this new evidence before the judge. Pierce promptly filed an emergency motion to postpone the trial further or present new evidence. The prosecutor, under pressure, insisted the statement was unverified hearsay. The showdown was set for that very evening in an emergency hearing. Toby and Pierce arrived at the courthouse just as a thunderstorm broke, rain lashing the streets, thunder rumbling like distant cannons. Toby felt it matched the mood, a brewing storm of secrets about to explode. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Toby clutched the phone with trembling hands, ready to play the short recording for the judge if needed. But as Toby and Pierce approached the door, a tall figure stepped from the shadows, none other than the man Toby remembered from the steps outside, wearing a leather jacket. His glare pinned Toby. "Stop now," he snarled under the thunder's roar. "There's no place for kids in a grown-up's mess. Turn around or you'll never see tomorrow." Pierce tried to shield Toby, but the man brandished something, a glint of metal in his pocket, possibly a knife or a gun. Adrenaline surged. "Pierce," Toby whispered, "we need help." Footsteps rang out behind them. Detective Farley, his coat drenched from the downpour, strode in with two uniformed officers. They leveled their weapons, ordering the man to freeze. The assailant cursed and bolted, footsteps echoing down the marble corridor. Farley's officers chased him. Pierce ushered Toby inside the courtroom, both of them rattled. "You okay?" Pierce whispered. Toby nodded, breath shaky. "Yeah, I guess so." The hearing commenced, Judge Whitmore presiding with a stern expression. Pierce introduced the new information about Charles Beckett, the alleged smuggling operation, and the phone call from Rachel Gleason. Toby played the recorded snippet, Rachel's voice speaking about Henry's innocence. The prosecutor tried to claim it was still uncorroborated, but Judge Whitmore looked troubled. "Mr. Pierce, do you have any further evidence linking Ms. Gleason's statement to the murder?" Pierce cited the suspicious logs found in the warehouse near the docks, the timeline of Fiona Hayes' actions, and Toby's eyewitness account at the park. He argued that the real killers had threatened both Fiona and Rachel, then pinned it on Henry. The judge rubbed her temples. "I will not move forward with final arguments until a thorough investigation is completed," she declared. "If Beckett or his associates orchestrated this murder, we cannot convict Henry Morales on flimsy circumstantial evidence." Henry, seated quietly with exhaustion etched on his face, finally managed a faint smile. Relief, though guarded, washed over him. Toby felt a similar wave of relief, but also a new surge of dread. If they were forcing the justice system to pivot, how far would Beckett's men go to keep their secrets buried? The hearing adjourned with a directive from the judge to reconvene in 72 hours, pending results of the new investigation. The swirling tension outside the courthouse was thick as Toby, Leslie, and Pierce stepped into the rain-swept parking lot, escorted by Detective Farley. The clouds hung low, and lightning fractured the sky in brilliant shards. Toby realized a storm was truly raging, both outside and in the hearts of those determined to see justice done. "We need protective custody," Pierce insisted, turning to Farley. "They've already threatened Toby multiple times." Farley nodded. "I'll arrange it, but we're stretched thin. We'll do our best." Toby's mother, soaked to the bone, clasped Toby's hand, fear and resolve mingling on her face. Toby thought of a quote his grandfather used to say, "Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway." He was terrified, no question about it. Yet he saw Henry's eyes, brimming with hope for the first time, and Toby knew he couldn't back down. They would stand firm, come what may. But Toby couldn't predict just how quickly events would escalate. Late that night, while Toby tried to rest in a safe house apartment provided by the authorities, his phone lit up. Another unknown number. Heart racing, he answered. "Hello?" Silence at first, then a frantic whisper. "They found me," a woman's voice breathed, close to tears. "Toby, is that you? It's Rachel." Toby sat bolt upright. "Rachel, are you all right? Where are?" "No time," she gasped. "Meet Oakwood Docks, Warehouse 14 tomorrow at dawn. I have proof. Must hurry." A muffled crash interrupted her. She cried out, voice ragged with desperation, "Hurry!" Then the line went dead. Toby's blood turned to ice. He leaped to his feet, shouting for his mother. Leslie stumbled into the living room, hair disheveled. "What happened?" Toby relayed the call. She looked alarmed. "We have to tell the police." Toby nodded. But something about the urgency in Rachel's voice told him that if they delayed even a few hours, this last chance to save her and prove Henry's innocence could vanish. Even so, Toby forced himself to do the right thing. Call Detective Farley. The detective sounded exhausted but told Toby, "Don't go anywhere on your own. I'll assemble a team. We'll raid Warehouse 14 at dawn." Toby gulped, nodding even though Farley couldn't see him. But an uneasy feeling gripped him. If the conspirators suspected a police raid, they might flee or kill Rachel before help arrived. Toby's chest tightened with indecision. He was just a kid. Should he trust the authorities or follow that inner compulsion to do something himself? Leslie watched him pace, worry etched in her features. "We'll let the professionals handle this, Toby," she said, voice firm. "You've done more than enough." Toby sank onto the couch, adrenaline still firing in his veins. He stared at the clock, 2:14 a.m. Dawn was only a few hours away. He prayed the police would reach Rachel in time. Meanwhile, the memory of that scuffle in the park haunted him. He recalled how powerless he felt, how that woman, whoever she was, had needed help he couldn't provide. Now Rachel was in danger for possibly the same reason, trying to expose a monstrous secret. Toby was certain no matter how this ended, it would change him forever. The hours crept by in excruciating slowness. Toby drifted in and out of a restless doze, jolted awake by every sound outside. Finally, the eastern sky began to pale. Detective Farley texted at 5:40 a.m. "Mobilizing now. Stay put." Toby read it, a knot of dread tangling in his stomach. He peered out the window, imagining the dark, creaking emptiness of Warehouse 14 by the docks. He thought of Rachel, alone, possibly captive. The clock ticked. 50. Toby couldn't bear it. Leslie, too tired to remain upright, had dozed off in a chair. Toby stood, exhaled, and stealthily grabbed his jacket. He scribbled a note. "I have to make sure she's safe. Forgive me, Mom." Then he slipped out. The morning air bit with a cold edge, the sky draped in charcoal clouds. Toby hopped on a borrowed bike from the building's storage area, an older mountain bike, squeaking at every rotation of the pedals. Fear churned in his gut, but something stronger propelled him forward. the conviction that if he could just reach Rachel, he might stop a tragedy. The Oakwood docks were on the far side of the city, a place Toby had rarely been. Factories and warehouses rose like silent behemoths, the stench of the lake mixing with industrial fumes. The streets were nearly deserted at that early hour. Toby wove through back alleys, using the directions he'd memorized, each pedal stroke pounding with the thought, "Faster! Must go faster!" He arrived at the chain-link fence bordering the docks as dawn broke, painting the horizon a dusty pink. His heart thundered. The sprawling complex was dotted with shipping containers, narrow lanes, and looming warehouses. He approached a small gate, locked, no guard in sight. Toby scaled the fence, ripping his jeans and scraping his hands, but adrenaline numbed the pain. He landed on the other side, crouching behind a stack of pallets. Warehouse 14 loomed about 50 yards away, a rusted number clinging to corrugated metal like a relic from another time. Toby crept closer, mindful that any sound might alert watchers. The overhead lights flickered inside the warehouse, visible through grimy windows. Voices drifted on the air, low, menacing. Toby's stomach clenched. He edged around to a side entrance. The heavy door stood ajar. Pressing his ear to the gap, Toby heard a desperate cry. "Please, I'm telling you, I don't have the files anymore," a woman sobbed. "Just let me go. I won't." A man's voice snarled. "Shut up. You should have kept your mouth shut months ago." Toby sucked in a sharp breath. That had to be Rachel Gleason. If he barged in, he'd be powerless. But if he waited, the police might not arrive in time. He stepped back, heart slamming, scanning the area. A metal pipe lay abandoned by some construction debris. Toby grabbed it. Then, mustering every ounce of courage, he nudged the door further open. He recognized the man from before, the leather-jacketed thug who threatened Toby outside the courthouse. Another man, bigger, stood on the other side, arms crossed. Rachel was bound to a chair, tears streaking her dirty face. A third figure hovered in the background. A tall man, wearing an expensive-looking coat, face partially hidden in the dim light. Toby guessed it was Charles Beckett himself. Toby's blood roared in his ears. Beckett turned to Rachel with a sneer. "You thought you could bring down my entire enterprise? That a teacher and a nobody assistant could topple me?" He laughed harshly. "What did you even hope to accomplish?" Rachel winced, voice trembling. "We just wanted to protect those kids. They were being exploited." Fiona said. "Fiona was naive. She got what she deserved," Beckett spat. "Now you'll join her if you don't." Suddenly, a distant siren wailed. Toby's chest flooded with relief. The police were coming. Beckett whipped his head around. "They're here," he hissed. "Deal with her, then we're gone." The big man advanced, brandishing a gun. Rachel screamed. Toby's entire being froze, fear like a bolt of lightning. He had seconds to act. Clutching the pipe, Toby flung the door open with a bang. The men spun around. Toby rushed in, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Stop!" For a brief, surreal moment, everyone stood stunned by the sight of a small, panting boy. Then Beckett snarled, "You again?" The big man raised his weapon, but Toby swung the pipe, clipping the man's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. Rachel let out a sob of relief. Leather Jacket lunged, grappling Toby's arm. Toby thrashed wildly, fighting with every ounce of adrenaline. The man wrenched the pipe away, aiming a vicious blow. Toby ducked, heart hammering. Then, from outside, a volley of shouted commands. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Lights from multiple squad cars strobed through the warehouse windows. Detective Farley's voice boomed. Beckett cursed, eyes darting. "Kill them both," he ordered. But it was too late. The warehouse door burst open, officers pouring in with guns raised. Leather Jacket froze. The big man tried to retrieve the fallen gun, but an officer's bullet soared overhead as a warning. He threw his hands up. Beckett turned to run, but Farley tackled him to the ground. Toby tumbled backward, chest heaving. Officers took control, cuffing the criminals. Farley barked for paramedics to check Rachel. Toby scrambled to his feet, swaying with relief. He glanced at Rachel, who offered a tearful, grateful nod. "Thank you," she whispered. A swirl of uniformed bodies filled the warehouse, chaos gradually transforming into methodical police procedure. In the midst of it all, Toby stood, shaking with an overload of fear and triumph. Detective Farley gently guided Toby outside, where the early dawn light seemed impossibly bright after the gloom. "You all right, kid?" Toby took a shaky breath, tears prickling his eyes. "I think so. You did something incredibly brave," Farley said, voice thick with respect, or incredibly foolish. Toby let out a strange laugh sob. I know, he whispered. Soon, Rachel was escorted out, paramedics checking her bruises. She clung to Toby, tears streaming. You saved my life, you and that policeman, if you hadn't come. Toby didn't know how to respond. He just squeezed her hand. His mother arrived moments later, frantic, hugging Toby as if she'd never let go. I was so worried, she sobbed, half angry, half relieved. Toby wilted into her arms, exhaustion hitting him like a tidal wave. But the day's events were far from over. Charles Beckett and his thugs were cuffed, arrested on charges ranging from kidnapping to murder conspiracy. Rachel gave a preliminary statement, confirming the smuggling ring and Fiona Hayes' plan to expose them. She wept as she recounted how Fiona had refused hush money, determined to free students from an exploitative cycle. They killed her to keep the truth buried, then framed Henry Morales simply because he'd had an unrelated spat with Fiona. Toby's eyes stung with tears, thinking of the gentle man locked in a cell. But now justice was within reach. Pierce arrived, also soaked in sweat and worry. Toby, he said, voice thick, your actions and Rachel's bravery just saved Henry Morales from a lifetime behind bars. I don't know how to thank you. Toby looked down, cheeks warm. I'm just glad the truth came out. Hours later, in an emergency motion, Pierce presented the new evidence to Judge Whitmore. Rachel Gleason, though shaken, bravely took the stand to make an official statement. The judge listened, eyes narrowed, every so often darting a glance at Toby. By the end of Rachel's testimony, she was certain Henry Morales was innocent. The prosecution withdrew their case. Henry was released that very evening, walking out into the crisp night air with tears on his cheeks. He embraced Toby in front of a cluster of reporters. Cameras flashed, capturing the improbable image of a man hugging a boy who had, quite literally, saved his life. Toby thought of a quote he once saw in a newspaper. No act of kindness, however small, is ever wasted. He felt the weight of that truth. At last, Toby, Leslie, and Rachel gave their own statements to the authorities. Charles Beckett and his associates faced a barrage of charges, including first-degree murder. The city reeled from revelations that the rumored corruption was real, that a child's testimony and unwavering courage had cracked the facade. For Toby, the next few days blurred with interviews, forms, and heartfelt gratitude from people he never knew existed. Henry Morales visited Toby's apartment with a bouquet of flowers for Leslie and a baseball glove for Toby. You reminded me, Henry said quietly, that even in a broken world, there's still hope. Toby took the glove, tears burning the corners of his eyes, speechless. As the week passed, the trial of Charles Beckett loomed. Rachel prepared to testify again, this time with full police protection. Henry Morales tried to rebuild his life, still haunted by the months of wrongful suspicion. Toby, ironically, attempted to return to normalcy, school, chores, trying out for that baseball team. But something inside him had changed. He was no longer just a kid who glimpsed a random argument. He was a boy who stood up in open court, defying fear, to ensure justice prevailed. Yet, the story didn't end there. Whispers suggested that Beckett's network stretched beyond city limits. Some said there were more secrets lurking, more individuals who might seek revenge. Toby felt that dark possibility on the edge of his consciousness, like a storm cloud on the horizon. But for now, the immediate danger had passed. Henry was free. Fiona Hayes' memory was honored, her killers facing punishment. Rachel Gleason survived to tell the truth, shining a light so bright it scattered the cockroaches of corruption. One afternoon, as Toby sat on the steps of his apartment building, he reflected on everything. Leslie, returning from the grocery store, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You did something most adults wouldn't dare, she told him. I know it was scary, but I'm proud of you, and I think Fiona, wherever she is, would be proud too. Toby gazed at a passing cloud, swirling in the midday sun. He whispered, I just wish none of this had happened at all, but I'm glad I could help. Leslie nodded, hugging him close. Me too, she said softly. So ended the whirlwind that began with a small voice in a towering courtroom. And though the case's most urgent questions found answers, a sense of deeper reflection lingered, about the weight of truth, the cost of bravery, and the profound difference one voice, no matter how young, can make in the fight against injustice. As the old saying goes, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In Cleveland, Ohio, a 10-year-old boy named Toby Archer proved that sometimes all it takes is a single shout, "Stop!" to jolt that arc forward. Life in Cleveland had always seemed to flow in measured, predictable rhythms. Parents hurrying to work each morning, students filling classrooms with chatter, and civic institutions humming along with relative consistency. Yet, after the events that freed Henry Morales and exposed Charles Beckett's criminal network, the city felt different, like a wound had been opened and was still waiting to be fully healed. For Toby Archer, the 10-year-old boy at the epicenter of it all, the aftermath brought a swirl of mixed emotions. On one hand, he had helped save an innocent man from prison and shone a light on a trafficking scheme that preyed on the most vulnerable. On the other hand, he had come face to face with violent criminals who had made clear they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. It didn't help that Toby's newfound notoriety drew curious stares from neighbors and classmates who whispered in awe, or sometimes skepticism, about his role in toppling a local kingpin. Even before the dust had settled, Toby found himself dealing with renewed anxiety. On that first evening after Charles Beckett's arrest, he lay awake in his bed, staring at the pale glow of the street lamp outside his window. He could still hear echoes of that final confrontation in the warehouse, Rachel Gleason's terrified screams, the scuffle of shoes on concrete, Detective Farley's shouts. Whenever Toby closed his eyes, those images rushed back, vivid and unnerving. His mother, Leslie, kept a protective watch, determined that her son would not be left alone. Yet Toby felt a persistent hum of concern, as if a shadowy figure still lurked just out of sight. He recalled a quote he'd heard once, something often attributed to Mark Twain. "Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear." Toby understood that now. He had acted despite his terror, but the fear remained, refusing to vanish just because the city hailed him as a hero. Henry Morales, newly released, had found sanctuary in a friend's small guest house on the western edge of Cleveland. Though officially cleared of all charges, the man needed time and space to recover from his ordeal. One afternoon, he invited Toby and Leslie for a modest celebration, a quiet thank you gathering that included Toby's best friend, Kevin, and Henry's older sister, Clarita. The home was bright, though simply furnished, its large windows overlooking a yard brimming with daisies and creeping ivy. Toby's eyes caught a glimpse of a worn baseball glove resting on a small table near the door. Henry offered Toby a weak but warm grin and handed it over as a gift, telling him that every time Toby used it, he should remember how a single brave act can turn the tide of injustice. Toby managed a shy smile and clutched the glove to his chest, feeling a wave of gratitude that mingled with a pang of lingering unease. Late that evening, after Henry's small gathering, Detective Farley called Toby's mother, sounding subdued. "We have reason to believe Beckett may have partners across state lines," he began. "We're investigating additional locations. It's bigger than we first assumed." Leslie's brow creased, and she glanced over at Toby, who was reading on the couch. She lowered her voice, stepping into the kitchen. "Do we need to move again?" she asked. "My son's been through enough." Farley paused. "We have no direct evidence they're targeting Toby, but if I'm honest, we can't be too cautious. Keep your guard up, and don't hesitate to contact me if anything suspicious happens." Leslie agreed, her heart heavy. She wanted Toby to return to the carefree routine of school, friends, and baseball. Instead, they were preparing for the possibility that more threats loomed. Despite the tension, Toby insisted on returning to his fifth-grade classroom the next day. The bustle of students, the smell of chalk dust, and the typical routine of reading assignments gave him some comfort. Yet, whispers filled the halls. "That's the boy who busted open that murder case. No way, he's just a kid. I heard he almost got shot." Toby tried to drown out the gossip by focusing on his math problems. At recess, Kevin approached him, eyes wide. "Dude, is it true they arrested like a billionaire because of you?" Toby shook his head. "He's not a billionaire, he's just a powerful businessman. But yeah, it's complicated." Kevin grinned. "That's wild. You're basically a hero." Toby shrugged, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions, a shy gratitude, and a gnawing sense that he wasn't done being afraid. When school let out, Toby found Leslie waiting in the pickup line. She offered a half smile, ushering him into the car. "We need to drop by the courthouse," she explained. "Detective Farley wants to go over your statement again, just to tie up loose ends for the Beckett trial." Toby's stomach knotted. The thought of another courthouse visit made him remember the moment he first shouted for the judge to stop the proceedings. It felt like a lifetime ago, though only weeks had passed. He nodded silently, bracing himself for the stares and questions sure to come. They arrived at the grand building of stone columns and high-arched entrances, its facade still exuding that stoic power Toby had grown to both respect and fear. Inside, while Leslie spoke quietly with the receptionist, Toby noticed a swirl of new faces. Attorneys, clerks, and even journalists bustled about, referencing an upcoming bombshell trial. Toby's ears perked up. The conversation drifting through the hallway made it clear. Charles Beckett's case was the event of the decade. The smuggling ring was rumored to involve not just local criminals, but also out-of-state contacts, possibly linked to corruption in other industries. A sense of dread curled in Toby's chest. If Beckett had powerful allies, they might still do anything to quash the investigation. Detective Farley emerged from a corridor, beckoning Toby and Leslie into a small, windowless room. Piles of folders and labeled evidence bags cluttered the narrow table. The detective cleared his throat, fatigue etched into his features. "Thank you for coming. We're building a thorough case against Beckett and his associates, and your eyewitness account remains crucial. Rachel Gleason's testimony is also key, but she's still quite shaken. She's under protective custody, but each time we plan a meeting, she's paralyzed by fear that someone's going to snatch her again." Toby felt a pang of guilt, recalling how terrified Rachel had been in that warehouse. "How can I help?" he asked, folding his hands. Farley shuffled a few documents. "Just reconfirm details. We can't have any holes for the defense to poke into. They'll try to discredit you as an over-imaginative child. We need exact recollections. The moment you entered the warehouse, your interactions with Beckett's men, how you freed Rachel." Toby took a steadying breath. His voice trembled as he recounted the confrontation. The door banging open, the sight of Rachel tied to a chair, the metallic clang of the pipe he'd wielded. Farley nodded, occasionally pressing for specifics. Leslie watched from the corner, eyes clouded with concern. When they finished, Toby felt drained. Farley's weary gratitude offered little solace. "You did great, kid," he said. "You're a key witness. Don't let anyone bully you into silence." Toby gave a small nod, but anxiety crawled under his skin. As they left, he overheard an officer mention that Beckett's bail hearing was fast approaching. Toby paused, considering that possibility. Beckett might walk free on bond if the judge found no direct physical evidence connecting him to violence. Toby's gut twisted. If a judge allowed bail, Beckett would be back on the streets, possibly coordinating from behind the scenes. That notion haunted him. Back in the car, Leslie tried to reassure Toby. "Farley and the other officers won't let Beckett out easily," she said, patting Toby's hand. "They have evidence of kidnapping and attempted murder. That has to count for something." Toby stared out the window. Cleveland's skyline loomed against a darkening horizon, neon lights flickering to life. He tried to cling to that sense of justice he had felt the day Henry was released. Still, a voice inside whispered that Beckett's power extended into corners of influence that Toby could barely fathom. That night, Toby fought insomnia. Memories flickered in his mind like a film reel with no off switch. The next morning, he walked into the kitchen to find Leslie staring at her phone, face pale. "Honey," she said carefully, "there's news. The judge denied Beckett's bail, but another suspect, someone high up in the same organization, just posted bond and might be out. They're not releasing his identity yet." Toby felt as though a cold wind had swept through the room. "So there's another person, just as dangerous, roaming free?" Leslie nodded grimly, refusing to sugarcoat the truth. Toby tried to keep calm, reminded of that saying from Ralph Waldo Emerson, "A hero is no braver than an ordinary man, but he is brave 5 minutes longer." Toby hoped he could gather that extra 5 minutes of bravery if danger came knocking again. A few days later, Toby's routine was shattered once more. After an uneventful morning at school, he returned to the office of Weston Pierce, Henry Morales' defense attorney turned ally. Pierce had requested Toby's presence to clarify certain points about the timeline of his original discovery. Toby wondered why this was necessary, now that Henry was already freed, but he sensed that Pierce wanted to ensure every piece of Toby's story was crystal clear. The older man met them in a cluttered conference room, stacks of files crowding the table. "Toby," he greeted, offering a warm but weary smile. "Thanks for coming. I'm actually looking into a broader angle. Why exactly was Henry framed so quickly, and by whom?" Toby frowned. "I thought Beckett's men just needed someone convenient to blame." Pierce leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, that's the short version, but there might be a link to the local precinct or another official who fast-tracked Henry as a suspect. Some corners were cut, or evidence was ignored. If someone in law enforcement helped push that narrative, it's corruption, and that means Henry still isn't entirely safe." Leslie stiffened in her chair. "Corruption in the police force?" Pierce shrugged. "We can't rule it out. I have no proof yet, but too many anomalies suggest an inside hand." Toby's mouth went dry. The mere idea that a detective or officer might be working against them from the shadows was terrifying. Henry Morales, who had come to the office that day for an update, lingered near the door. "All I know is that the day after Fiona died, they arrested me," he recalled, eyes distant. "No thorough questioning, no thorough search for other suspects. They zeroed in on me almost immediately." Toby exchanged a glance with Leslie, feeling a renewed sense of foreboding. If the corruption ran deeper, then Toby, Henry, and Rachel could still be at significant risk. Pierce nodded gravely. "I'll keep digging. In the meantime, Toby, just be cautious. Even if Beckett is behind bars, plenty of people might want to tie up loose ends." A swirl of events followed. Detective Farley arranged additional security for Toby's apartment complex, periodic patrols, plainclothes officers in the neighborhood. Rumors circulated that Rachel Gleason might testify against not only Beckett, but a string of co-conspirators. Toby, for his part, tried to lead a semi-normal life, finishing homework, practicing with his new baseball glove, quietly dealing with the stares of curious classmates. But calm proved fleeting. One crisp morning, Toby found a note slipped under the windshield wiper of Leslie's car. It read in thick, black letters, "Boy or no boy, you meddle and you pay." No signature, no clue to the author's identity, just an ugly threat that clenched Toby's heart in icy fear. Leslie turned the note over to Detective Farley immediately. While he promised to investigate, Toby could see on the detective's face the frustration of chasing anonymous leads in a city of 500,000 people. Against this backdrop, the legal machinations pressed onward. Preliminary hearings for Beckett's trial loomed, with Toby and Rachel scheduled as star witnesses. The press hounded them at every turn, camera crews popping up on the sidewalk, reporters calling out for sound bites. "Toby, how does it feel to be the child hero who uncovered the truth?" "Are you worried about retribution?" Toby froze under those lenses, unsure how to respond. Thankfully, Pierce insisted the media keep their distance, citing Toby's status as a minor. Still, tabloids latched on to the sensational angle, spinning narratives that sometimes edged into hyperbole. Toby's classmates teased him with headlines like, "Kid Crusader takes on crime boss." He tried to laugh it off, but the lingering threat in the air made it all feel more ominous than glamorous. The day of Beckett's preliminary hearing arrived under a leaden sky, the sun absent behind thick clouds. A biting wind swept across the courthouse steps. Toby and Leslie arrived in a police cruiser, escorted by Detective Farley. Inside, they joined Pierce and Henry Morales in a reserved chamber. Pierce explained the process to Toby. "You may not have to testify today. The prosecutor just needs to establish there's enough evidence to move forward. Rachel's statement, the evidence from the warehouse, and your own experiences should suffice." Toby nodded, though a swirl of apprehension roiled in his stomach. Henry patted Toby's shoulder. "You've done more than most adults ever would," Henry said softly. "We owe you our lives." Proceedings began in a small, wood-paneled courtroom. Beckett appeared in shackles, wearing an orange jumpsuit that did nothing to diminish his aura of arrogance. Toby watched the man's cold gaze sweep the room, lingering briefly on Toby before flicking away, as though Toby were a mere annoyance. The prosecutor, a tall woman named Camilla West, methodically laid out the facts gathered so far. Beckett's ties to illegal shipments, the logs discovered at the warehouse, the kidnapping of Rachel Gleason, and the threats made against Toby. She stressed that Beckett's motive for killing Fiona Hayes stemmed from her attempts to expose the smuggling ring using Henry Morales as a scapegoat. Beckett's defense attorney, a slick-looking man with an expensive suit, rose to challenge every point. He claimed there was no physical evidence tying Beckett directly to Fiona's murder, nor proof that his client orchestrated the kidnapping. The so-called testimony of a frightened woman and a young boy is nothing but hearsay, he argued. Toby felt his jaw clench. The defense attorney's dismissive attitude toward Toby's involvement felt personal, an insult to all he had risked. Meanwhile, Beckett sat silent, lips curved in what might have been a faint smirk. After hours of legal sparring, the judge decided the state had met the burden of probable cause, sending the case to trial. A hush of tension and relief flooded the room. The gavel's strike echoed, signifying that Charles Beckett would remain behind bars until trial, unless something changed. Toby exhaled slowly, but a sliver of dread persisted. He could sense Beckett's unwavering confidence, as though the man believed he still controlled the board in a high-stakes chess game. That afternoon, Toby left the courthouse to find more reporters waiting. He lowered his head, pressing closer to Leslie. One journalist, bold enough to slip through the group, thrust a microphone near Toby's face. "You're a hero, Toby. What message do you have for kids who want to do the right thing?" Toby blinked, speechless under the camera's glare. Before he could respond, a police officer guided them away. Yet Toby thought about that question long afterward. If someone asked him, why risk so much? Toby's answer would be simple: because letting an innocent man rot in prison and letting criminals exploit the vulnerable felt more terrifying than stepping up to speak. There was a line Toby's mom used to repeat: bad things happen when good people do nothing. Toby couldn't let himself become part of that problem, even if it meant nightmares and threats. Over the next week, Toby found a new routine emerging. Attend school, keep his head down, and then accompany Leslie or Detective Farley to any newly scheduled meetings about the trial. Rachel Gleason, gradually regaining some composure, tried to contact Toby to express her gratitude. They spoke by phone once, her voice trembling with guilt that a child had faced so much danger on her behalf. "Don't ever think that," Toby told her. "I only did what I had to." It wasn't bravado. It was simply the truth as Toby understood it. As the actual trial date neared, tension in Cleveland seemed to mount. More arrests were made across the state, contacts in Beckett's network who facilitated shipping illegal cargo. Detective Farley commented that it was like unraveling a ball of knotted yarn. Each lead exposed another link in the conspiracy. Toby tried to remain optimistic, but he was also realistic enough to realize that the bigger the ring, the higher the chance that some dangerous individual might be lurking, eager to shut him up for good. One crisp autumn evening, Toby sat in the living room, doing math homework. Leslie was cooking stir-fry in the kitchen, the scent of garlic and onions filling the apartment. A ring on the doorbell startled them both. Toby felt a jolt of apprehension. They weren't expecting visitors. Leslie peered through the peephole, frowning. She opened the door to reveal an older woman with kind eyes and a posture that suggested both fatigue and determination. "Ma'am, my name is Lucinda Morales," the woman said. "Henry is my cousin. May I speak with Toby Archer?" Leslie hesitated but eventually let her in, calling Toby over. Lucinda introduced herself gently, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Henry told me everything you did, Toby. I just wanted to thank you in person." Toby felt awkward but appreciated the warmth of her demeanor. She pulled a small crocheted scarf from her bag. "I made this. It's not much, but I want you to have it so you'll remember how grateful my entire family is." Toby accepted the scarf, eyes stinging. "Thank you," he whispered, touched by her sincerity. Lucinda smiled softly. "Henry says you saved not just him, but our whole family from the heartbreak of injustice. I hope you never doubt you did the right thing." Toby nodded, overcome by a wave of emotion, yet also reminded again of how big an impact his actions had on so many people. After Lucinda left, Toby felt that familiar swirl, pride laced with lingering dread. He tried to focus on the sense of purpose it gave him, thinking of a quote from Winston Churchill his teacher once mentioned: "Fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision." Toby realized he'd been making that decision almost daily, even though he was never truly unafraid. The next day brought a new development. Pierce, who had been investigating possible law enforcement corruption, discovered a puzzling discrepancy in the original police files implicating Henry. Certain evidence logs had vanished, replaced by vague notes. Pierce suspected a cover-up. Toby overheard a tense phone call between Pierce and Detective Farley, discussing an officer named Martin Russo who might have close ties to Beckett's empire. Toby's mind reeled. An officer colluding with the criminals? That possibility felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. If the people sworn to protect citizens had turned traitor, who could be trusted? When Toby confided his worries to Leslie, she insisted they share them with Detective Farley. Farley, though stoic, confirmed that they were investigating Russo quietly, worried that tipping him off might destroy evidence or spark retaliation. Toby tried to swallow the panic rising in his throat. He wished he could wave a wand and fix everything at once, but reality was more intricate and dangerous than any story he'd read. Soon, Toby faced an even bigger test of his resolve. One chilly dawn, he and Leslie woke to the sound of frantic knocking. Leslie opened the door to find Henry Morales, disheveled, eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I'm so sorry," he gasped, voice cracking. "It's my sister, Clarita. She's missing." Toby's heart plummeted. "Missing? What do you mean?" Henry explained that Clarita had left her house the previous afternoon but never returned. Her phone went dead. He found her car abandoned near the edge of Roosevelt Park. Toby's thoughts whirled. Roosevelt Park, the same place Toby had first witnessed that violent argument. Had the conspirators taken Clarita to pressure Henry or Toby? Leslie immediately called the police. Detective Farley arrived within the hour, grim-faced. A missing persons alert was issued, but Toby knew how these things could spiral. His mind conjured images of Clarita held captive, threatened, perhaps somewhere at the mercy of Beckett's associates or a crooked cop. Henry paced the living room, desperation etched in every gesture. "She told me she was going to meet a friend about a job opportunity," he muttered, "but she never said who." Toby clenched his fists. "We have to find her. This can't be a coincidence." Farley nodded curtly, phone pressed to his ear. "I'm putting out an APB. Our best guess is that someone recognized Clarita from your release event, Henry. They could be using her to leverage your silence or Toby's." Henry swallowed hard, eyes brimming with tears. Toby recalled how Clarita had been at that small get-together, smiling and so happy for Henry's freedom. Now she was in danger because of the twisted network they had challenged. As the day wore on, Toby tried to help however he could, rummaging for any clue Clarita might have left. Henry provided a note Clarita had scribbled. "Meeting M about job, Park Cafe?" The word park jolted Toby's memory. He recalled the letter he once found from Rachel Gleason referencing shady meetings near the park. Could M stand for Martin Russo? Toby asked, heart pounding. Farley's eyes narrowed. Possible. Russo is suspected of assisting Beckett. Clarita might have walked into a trap. A surge of guilt consumed Toby. He had hoped the nightmare was ending, but it seemed to be deepening instead. The hours trickled by, each feeling like an eternity. Evening arrived with no word on Clarita's whereabouts. Henry grew frantic, alternating between furious outbursts and silent despair. Toby tried to console him, though he himself was terrified. At around 9 p.m., Detective Farley received a tip from a local patrol officer. A woman matching Clarita's description was spotted near an abandoned boatyard by the lakeside, accompanied by 2 men wearing dark clothes. Farley didn't want to storm the location blindly. He assembled a small team for a stealth operation, concerned that Clarita could be used as a hostage if the criminals caught wind of law enforcement. Henry insisted on joining, but Farley and Leslie vetoed that. Toby, though he wanted to help, knew better than to beg to come along. This was a dangerous mission, best left to professionals. He sat with Leslie and Henry in the station lounge, hearts pounding, waiting for any update. The smell of stale coffee and the flicker of fluorescent lights gave the room a hollow, uneasy vibe. Henry muttered prayers in Spanish, tears glistening on his lashes. Toby couldn't find words to comfort him, so he just stayed close, letting Henry know he wasn't alone. After what felt like an agonizing lifetime, an officer burst in with good news. Clarita had been found alive. She was frightened and bruised, but otherwise unharmed. The kidnappers had fled just as Farley's team closed in, leaving her bound in a small storage shed by the boatyard. Toby and Henry breathed simultaneous sighs of relief. Leslie hurried to meet Clarita at the hospital. Toby and Henry followed, though Henry seemed scarcely able to stand. At the hospital, Clarita's expression lit up when she saw Henry, tears of joy mixing with trauma. She recounted that one of her abductors had mentioned Toby's name. They said something like, "That kid and Morales think they're heroes. We'll show them what real power is." Toby's blood ran cold. He realized again that he and Henry remained targets, and the criminals would use any means to break them. Detective Farley, who arrived soon after, took Clarita's statement. She recalled how she'd met with a man calling himself Mike, but she noticed his police badge glinting under his jacket, an older model badge. Before she could react, a second man grabbed her from behind. Then everything went black until she woke tied up in that shed. Farley exchanged a meaningful glance with Toby. An older model badge. That might be Russo's or someone connected. Toby felt sick that his hunch about corruption in the force was inching closer to reality. Clarita, exhausted, told them she heard them arguing about sending a message to Toby and Henry. Thankfully, the swift police raid thwarted their plans. A swirl of relief and ongoing fear filled the small hospital room. As Henry hugged his sister tightly, Toby sensed this saga was far from over. Indeed, in the following days, the puzzle pieces began to align. Pierce uncovered financial records linking Officer Martin Russo to suspicious deposits, matching the time frame of Henry's wrongful arrest. Meanwhile, Clarita's recollection of the older badge gave Farley enough probable cause to search Russo's belongings. There, hidden in a locked trunk, they found additional proof of collusion with Beckett's associates. Russo was arrested, though he denied all allegations. Toby, reading about the news, felt a grim sense of vindication. The noose around Beckett's conspiracy was tightening. But with each new arrest, tension mounted. More people found themselves entangled, and Toby dreaded a final, desperate retaliation. With Russo in custody, the focus turned to the upcoming trial. The prosecution's case was strengthening daily, yet Beckett's attorney launched a relentless campaign to discredit Toby, Henry, and Rachel Gleason. Filings in court alleged Toby's childlike imagination, Henry's motive for vengeance after a personal dispute, and Rachel's unstable emotional state. Toby clenched his jaw reading headlines spinning the defense's perspective. Is the so-called child hero telling tall tales? The local news channels pounced on the drama, feeding a divided public discourse. Some believed Toby wholeheartedly, while others began to parrot the defense's doubts. Toby felt each doubt like a pinprick in his confidence, yet he refused to back down. He drew courage from Leslie, Henry, Clarita, and from Rachel's unwavering gratitude. He told himself, even if the world turns upside down, I'll speak my truth. As the trial date drew near, the tension around Toby's testimony soared. The court set a schedule. Toby would testify on the second day, following opening statements and some of the forensic evidence presentations. Rachel Gleason would testify right after Toby. Henry Morales was expected to speak on the third day, describing how he was framed. The night before the trial began, Toby found himself in a hotel room under police protection because anonymous threats had surfaced once more. A scribbled note left near Toby's locker at school read, "Stay out of the witness stand or else." The next day, Toby was quietly removed from classes to keep him safe. Inside that modest hotel room, Toby lay on a stiff bed, staring at the beige wallpaper. His mother dozed in a chair beside him, still wearing her clothes. Detective Farley stood guard in the hallway. Toby's thoughts whirled, unable to rest. He couldn't escape the feeling that tomorrow would change everything again. Yet, he remembered something Henry once told him in a moment of quiet. Sometimes truth only blooms in the darkest soil. Toby whispered it aloud, letting the words anchor him. If he had a chance to speak in court, he would do so with all the clarity and courage he could muster. Morning arrived all too soon, bringing a chilly drizzle that cast a gloom over the city. Toby, Leslie, and Farley arrived at the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid the crush of reporters. They slipped into a waiting room behind the main courtroom. Through a narrow window in the door, Toby caught a glimpse of spectators, cameras, and the imposing figure of Charles Beckett, flanked by his defense. The man's calm composure remained unnerving, as though he believed this entire charade would soon be dismissed. When the bailiff ushered Toby in, he felt his knees wobble slightly. The room's hush pressed in on him. Judge Harriet Whitmore presided over the case again, her stern visage now familiar to Toby, though she appeared more fatigued than before. The jury, a group of men and women in ordinary clothes, watched Toby with measured curiosity. The prosecutor, Camilla West, offered a gentle nod of encouragement. Toby stepped up to the witness stand, took the oath, and tried to steady his breathing. From a far corner, Beckett's eyes bored into him. Camilla West began, her tone gentle but firm. "Toby Archer, please tell us how you first became involved in this case." Toby recounted that fateful day in Roosevelt Park, his voice carrying more sureness than he expected. He described the argument he overheard, the man in the black jacket, the presence of a second figure, and how it initially led him to suspect Fiona Hayes' murder was more complex than the public believed. The room remained utterly silent, all ears on the boy who had risked everything. Miss West proceeded with more questions, guiding Toby through the discovery of the broken pendant, the menacing emails, the final confrontation in the warehouse where Rachel was held captive. Toby's heart pounded, but he forced his voice to remain steady, recalling every detail as best he could. Occasionally, Miss West would display a piece of evidence on a projector: the note from Rachel, the smuggling logs, the police reports referencing Toby's statements. Toby felt relief each time the puzzle fit together, confirming his account. Then came the defense's turn. Beckett's attorney, a man named Robert Vale, approached the witness stand with a practiced air of polite condescension. He smiled thinly at Toby. "Young Mr. Archer, your courage is admirable," he began, emphasizing the last word with a slight sneer. "But sometimes in our eagerness to do good, we might misinterpret what we see or hear. Wouldn't you agree?" Toby's mouth felt dry. "I did my best to understand what happened," he replied. "I'm not misinterpreting." Vale paced casually. "Yet you claim to see a black jacket in the park, and you assert it was connected to Fiona Hayes' death. Are you aware that thousands of people in Cleveland own black jackets? Could you have simply observed a heated argument unrelated to Miss Hayes at all?" Toby bristled. "Maybe, but the timing, the location, and everything that happened afterward makes me believe it was related. The logs, Rachel's testimony." Vale cut him off, spinning to address the jury. He's a well-meaning child who pieced together random bits of coincidences, then let his imagination run wild. Toby felt anger burn inside. The judge rapped her gavel lightly. "Stick to questions, Mr. Vale." Vale nodded, face composed. "Mr. Archer, do you claim to have recognized the voice of the man you say was in the park? Did you identify him as Charles Beckett specifically?" Toby hesitated. "Not at first. It was someone else, probably one of Beckett's associates." Vale seized on that. "So you cannot place my client at the crime scene, correct?" Toby swallowed. "No, not personally. But Rachel," Vale smirked. Yes, Miss Gleason will speak for herself. No further questions." He dismissed Toby with a wave of his hand. Toby stepped down, tense and frustrated. He'd told the truth, but Vale's tactic was clear: sow doubt without directly accusing Toby of lying. Miss West gave Toby a quick, reassuring nod, as if to say, "You did fine." Toby slid into a seat next to Leslie, exhaling shakily. The trial proceeded, with Rachel Gleason stepping onto the stand soon after. Her testimony carried more direct weight. She recounted how she and Fiona unearthed suspicious accounting that led back to Beckett, how she'd been kidnapped to prevent her from testifying. Vale once again tried to undermine her credibility, but Rachel held her ground despite trembling hands. Toby watched, admiration swelling. He knew how scared she was, but she refused to back down. Later that day, Henry Morales took the stand, explaining how he'd been close to Fiona, but had no reason to harm her. He detailed the suspiciously fast arrest that pinned him as the fall guy. The jury listened with rapt attention. Through it all, Beckett remained impassive, occasionally conferring with Vale or taking notes. Toby wished he could read the man's mind. Did Beckett believe he might still slip free? Or was it all a calculated facade? Court adjourned at dusk, leaving Toby exhausted. He and Leslie rode back to the hotel under police guard. The next days of testimony unfolded in a grueling dance of evidence and rebuttals. Forensic experts linked the shipping logs from the warehouse to Beckett's accounts. A digital forensics technician explained how emails from Beckett's address threatened Fiona Hayes' safety. The defense scrambled to cast doubt, painting Fiona as an unstable individual who might have had other enemies. But the weight of evidence piled higher and higher. Toby began to sense the tide was turning irreversibly. Nevertheless, the tension refused to ease. One afternoon, a group of suspicious men was spotted near Toby's school, prompting another security upgrade. A rumor spread that Beckett, from his jail cell, was orchestrating intimidation tactics. Toby found himself longing for the trial's end, hoping that once Beckett was convicted, the threat might recede. Yet, a voice in the back of his mind reminded him that even a convicted felon could maintain power if he had enough associates on the outside. On the final day of arguments, the courtroom brimmed with spectators, press, and local residents hungry for closure. Toby sat near the front with Leslie. Detective Farley stationed himself at the edge of the aisle, scanning for any sign of trouble. Miss West delivered a riveting closing argument, weaving together the threads of Toby's discovery, Rachel's kidnapping, Henry's innocence, and the concrete evidence tying Beckett to the smuggling ring and the murder conspiracy. She ended with a solemn appeal to the jury. You have heard from a child who refused to be silent, a teacher's assistant who risked her life to expose the truth, and an innocent man who lost his freedom until that child spoke up. Charles Beckett engineered a plot to protect his illicit business, and Fiona Hayes was killed for daring to step in his way. Now you must decide if justice will prevail in Cleveland. Then Vale rose for his closing argument. He attempted to portray the entire case as circumstantial. He questioned the reliability of Toby's age, Rachel's trauma, and Henry's motivations. He claimed the logs could have been fabricated or misread. Toby's stomach churned, but he reminded himself that the truth was too overwhelming to ignore. No matter how elegantly Val spun his words, the judge gave her final instructions to the jury, urging them to weigh each piece of evidence impartially. The bailiff led them out. The wait that followed was excruciating. Hours crawled by in a tension-laden hush. Toby, Leslie, Henry, and Rachel huddled together in a side hallway, occasionally exchanging quiet reassurances. Detective Farley paced, phone in hand. Beckett sat in a holding area, expression unreadable. At last, word spread that the jury had reached a verdict. The crowd filed back into the courtroom. Toby's palms felt clammy, his heart drumming a staccato rhythm. The judge asked the foreman of the jury to rise. In a clear, steady voice, the foreman delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. A collective gasp followed by murmurs rippled through the room. Henry bowed his head, tears slipping free. Rachel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Toby felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Charles Beckett remained stoic, but a flash of anger darkened his eyes. The judge thanked the jury, then announced sentencing would be scheduled in due time. Court was adjourned. A wave of applause from onlookers in the public gallery erupted. Cameras flashed. Toby braced himself for the onslaught of reporters, but for one moment he let relief wash over him like a gentle tide. Beckett's reign of intimidation had been exposed, his innocence shredded by evidence and testimonies. Toby, enveloped by Leslie's embrace, blinked back tears. He recalled a quote from Maya Angelou that Mrs. Freeman, his teacher, had once recited, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." Toby felt changed indeed, older in ways he couldn't fully articulate, yet determined not to let fear define him. The aftermath was a mixture of triumph and reflection. The next morning, Cleveland's newspapers blared headlines, "Guilty verdict for crime boss Beckett. Testimony of 10-year-old hero helped seal fate." Online articles praised Toby, calling him a symbol of moral courage. People recognized him on the street, offering thanks or curious stares. Henry Morales and Clarita visited Toby's apartment the following weekend, bringing fresh flowers and warm hugs. "We can't repay what you've done," Henry said, voice brimming with gratitude, "but we promise to pay it forward." Rachel Gleason, too, found some measure of peace, beginning therapy to address her trauma. She wrote Toby a heartfelt letter describing how she planned to use her experience to advocate for better protections for whistleblowers and victims. During a quiet evening at home, Toby and Leslie watched a televised segment featuring Detective Farley. The detective credited Toby's remarkable bravery, while also cautioning the city that other criminals might seek to exploit the gaps Beckett left behind. Toby frowned. He didn't want to live in constant fear that the next villain would surface. But Leslie, sensing his unease, reminded him that the system was a bit stronger now, thanks to the truth that had come to light. Toby nodded, leaning against her shoulder. He recalled an old line from Abraham Lincoln he'd once seen on a plaque. "I am a slow walker, but I never walk back." It seemed to fit how justice moved in Cleveland, slow with stumbles, but hopefully never backward. Over the following months, Toby regained a semblance of normalcy. He returned to his baseball practices, forging new friendships. The novelty of his story faded, replaced by daily life's smaller dramas, pop quizzes, weekend chores, and soccer matches. Yet Toby carried with him an invisible badge of resolve. He remembered the darkest moments of the ordeal, how fear had nearly paralyzed him, but how he had chosen each time to push forward. In quieter instances, like when he walked alone down a hallway or woke from a nightmare, he would silently remind himself of all the good that had come from his actions. Henry was free, Clarita was safe, Rachel had survived. Beckett was in prison, facing a lengthy sentence. And Toby was still here, forging ahead with the rest of his life. Henry Morales, exonerated and determined to use his second chance, returned to the community center where he had once worked with Fiona Hayes. In her memory, he founded a new initiative to help underprivileged youth stay out of trouble and stand up for each other. Toby visited one afternoon. He watched Henry talk to a group of kids about courage and honesty. Toby felt a lump in his throat, realizing the impact had rippled far beyond the individuals directly involved in the trial. Fiona's legacy, and Toby's stand, had blossomed into a meaningful project that would shape countless lives. Sometimes Toby would still glance around anxiously, half expecting a menacing figure to appear. But then he'd catch a glimpse of the battered baseball glove Henry gave him, or recall the crocheted scarf from Lucinda, or read Rachel's letter pinned to his wall. Each item grounded him, reminding him that life could hold immense beauty alongside the darkness. And if he ever needed a reminder, Toby had a cluster of new friendships with kids who admired not only his bravery, but also his humility. Many said Toby inspired them to speak up against bullying or wrongdoing at school. One cool afternoon, Toby sat alone by Roosevelt Park's pond, the place where everything started. Leaves drifted in lazy circles on the water's surface. He thought of that day he first witnessed a violent argument. All the terror, heartbreak, and eventual triumph had sprung from that moment. He inhaled, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. Then, with a certain reverence, he laid a small bouquet of wildflowers by a tree, silently honoring Fiona Hayes, the teacher who had lost her life trying to bring truth to light. Toby closed his eyes and spoke a quiet vow, that her story would not be forgotten, and that if ever faced with injustice again, he would find the strength to stand up. In the weeks that followed, Toby's life marched on with a sense of steady resilience. Detective Farley concluded the official investigation, ensuring each conspirator faced charges. The city, while still facing challenges, felt that a corner had been turned. Corruption in certain ranks of law enforcement was exposed, leading to reforms. For Toby, the lessons learned were carved into his heart, that one voice can make a monumental difference, that courage is forged in moments of profound fear, and that there is immense power in refusing to let evil remain hidden. Months later, after Beckett's final sentencing hearing, where the judge handed down multiple decades of prison time, Toby found himself once again in the courthouse corridor. Only this time, he wasn't there under threat or anxiety. He was there to witness the closing of a chapter. Henry Morales, Clarita, Rachel Gleason, and Detective Farley all gathered for a quiet chat. Toby arrived with Leslie, feeling a wave of warmth. No cameras flashed, no frenzy of reporters, just the soft hum of people conversing in the background. They spoke of how the city had changed, how Henry's youth initiative was thriving, how Rachel planned to write a series of articles about her experience to push for stronger whistleblower protections. As they parted ways, Toby lingered with Henry, the two gazing at the wide marble steps leading to the front exit. Henry placed a hand on Toby's shoulder. "I'd have lost hope if it wasn't for you," Henry admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being braver than the rest of us." Toby flushed. "I'm not braver," he countered. "I was just scared enough to know if I stayed quiet, I'd regret it forever." Henry nodded, eyes shining. That's true courage, Toby. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Walking down those steps, Toby felt the crisp air on his face and the warm sun breaking through scattered clouds. He recalled a line from Seneca he'd read during a project on ancient philosophy. Sometimes even to live is an act of courage. Toby knew that living, truly living, meant standing by one's moral code, even if it brought danger. Gazing across the downtown skyline, Toby felt a sense of deep peace and acceptance. The city wasn't perfect, and neither was life. But that didn't diminish his belief that good people, driven by conscience, could spark real change. That night, at home, Leslie made dinner while Toby finished a social studies assignment. A sense of normalcy, something precious and hard-won, pervaded the small apartment. Over dinner, Leslie asked Toby, "What do you want to do now that all this is behind us?" Toby thought for a moment, then shrugged softly. Live, play baseball, hang out with friends, maybe volunteer at Henry's youth program. Keep an eye out for people who might need help. Leslie smiled, eyes brimming with pride. That sounds like a good plan. They toasted with apple juice, a simple gesture that felt monumental after all they'd endured. Before bed, Toby curled up with a worn copy of his favorite adventure novel, reading until his eyes drooped. He paused once, letting the quiet settle. Outside, the muffled sounds of cars passing and distant sirens reminded him that the world kept turning with all its perils and wonders. He said a silent prayer for those who still needed someone to speak up for them, whether in Cleveland or beyond. And in that soft hush, Toby recalled one last quote, his grandfather's old favorite from Theodore Roosevelt. In any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing. The worst thing you can do is nothing. Toby Archer had decided to do the right thing, and for that, countless lives were forever changed. As the lamp clicked off and darkness enveloped his room, Toby felt an unshakable conviction that he would never forget the incredible journey from a trembling voice in a crowded courtroom to the unraveling of a criminal empire. There would be other battles, other voices needing to be heard, other truths waiting to be revealed. And though Toby was just a boy, he had learned a timeless lesson, that standing up for justice, even when you're terrified, can illuminate paths for everyone who follows. When morning came, Toby would awake to a world that still needed hope and courage. But he felt ready, more than ever, to be a part of that ongoing fight for what is right. He drifted into sleep with a final comforting thought, that if one voice, his voice, could set such a chain of events in motion, then perhaps everyone had that power, waiting to be discovered in their moment of truth. The greatest battles might be fought in quiet corners, in everyday parks, or even in the halls of law, but each person's decision to speak up could tip the balance. And in Cleveland, a 10-year-old boy had proven just how much that single choice could matter. The story's lessons glowed like embers. True courage resides in hearts that tremble but refuse to remain silent. Justice, while sometimes slow, is nurtured by those who dare to confront the darkness, and hope, ever resilient, emerges anew whenever an honest voice declares, "Stop, you can't do this." These truths Toby Archer carried within him. They became a part of his very soul, ensuring he would never again doubt the power of one determined boy to change the course of many lives.